So we left off talking about Teddy Roosevelt and his unique brand of progressivism. And the last major point we were discussing was that by becoming so progressive, for those variety of reasons that I listed, he was beginning to divide his own party. That his brand of progressivism was leading some Republicans to become more progressive, while causing others to step back and say, wait a minute, maybe we're going too far. And so we pick up here with this election of 1908. So Teddy Roosevelt came to end in 1908, and he had said he wouldn't run again. But he was so popular, he was able to choose his replacement, William Howard Taft. Taft was from Ohio, very educated, had a wealthy family. He was a progressive. Maybe not as progressive as Teddy, but he was a progressive Republican. So the Republican Party nominated Taft, and he promised to continue what Teddy had done. He even attempted to pass reforms Teddy Roosevelt had never even tried. For example, Taft attempted to lower the protective tariff, which most Republicans were very hesitant to approach. Now the Democrats chose William Jennings Bryan. This is his third try, right? Bryan was a reformer, but he was labeled a loser. And he had already lost twice, right? So come on, this is easy. America loves winners. So Teddy Roosevelt's going to support Taft, and Taft's going to win this election very easily. Now, while it may have started off with public support, Taft's presidency, his administration turned into a political disaster while Teddy Roosevelt was on vacation out of the country in Africa. The divisions in that Republican Party under Teddy Roosevelt's administration only got worse under Taft. And of course, Taft was not the man that Teddy Roosevelt was, and he was not able to hold the party together. Now here's the important point to remember. If the Republicans were to split, who were they opening the door for? Well, of course, the Democrats. So keep that in the back of your mind. Well, Taft's administration was not a total failure. His administration started twice as many antitrust actions than TR, even though Teddy Roosevelt goes down in the history books as the trust buster. And while Taft was president, 2 constitutional amendments were passed. The first 2 constitutional amendments since Reconstruction. The 16th Amendment was ratified, which brought about the nation's first income tax. And if you remember, the populist in that Omaha platform had first proposed this. So thanks a lot, guys. This first income tax passed in 1913 with something like a 2% top rate. And the Second Amendment was the 17th Amendment, which provided for the direct election of senators instead of state legislatures electing senators. The argument being that state legislators were controlled by special interests, so this provided for direct election by the people. Again, another Omaha platform. So some very important additions to the Constitution were accomplished under Taft. But the rest of his term as president was a complete disaster. The failures of Taft's administration, especially the political failures, ruined his administration. I'll give you 2 concrete examples as to what ruined his administration. Number 1, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909. Taft had campaigned on trying to reform the tariff, and he tried to do it. He called Congress into special session, and his new tariff bill started out in Congress as a low tariff introduced by a man by the name of Payne. It went to the Senate, which primarily represented big business, where a senator named Aldrich worked to amend it something like 100 times. The custom duties on that tariff kept being pushed higher and higher, and by the time it was finished, it was actually higher than it was in the beginning. And Taft made a huge mistake by not vetoing it, and instead, he actually supported it. And he called the Payne-Aldrich Tariff the best tariff passed by the Republicans, and he called it a reform. But everybody knew it wasn't. By signing the bill and supporting it, he alienated those progressive Republicans within his own party who knew the truth. Taft then got into an argument over conservationism. Taft's Secretary of the Interior was a man by the name of Richard Ballinger. There's some background to this. Ballinger was accused of reversing some of Teddy Roosevelt's conservation policies. Now, whether or not he did is not the issue. What is important is the aftermath. Congress investigated these accusations. They found Ballinger had done nothing wrong, and this probably would have been the end of it. But our friend Pinchot got involved. Pinchot began to criticize Ballinger in the press. So what you had here was the Secretary of the Interior being criticized by the head of the Forestry Service. Even though he might have been selected and the right-hand man in conservation to Teddy Roosevelt, he's still not on the same political level as Ballinger. Taft sided, of course, with his cabinet member because he's the one that hired Ballinger. And he fired Pinchot in 1910. He really had no other choice if you really look at it. And, this is business as usual. Yet for our purposes, this made Taft look like he was firing a Teddy Roosevelt person and not being a supporter of conservation. He was being anti-conservation, which is not true. But this angered the progressives even more. So we now begin to hear calls from progressives in the Republican Party for Teddy Roosevelt to come back from Africa, save the country. Now, TR arrived in the United States in 1910 from Africa. And he was interested in what was going on politically. It's pretty evident because he went on a speech-making tour across the United States. And on this tour, he began talking about something he called New Nationalism. You need to know what New Nationalism stands for. Because this speech, the elements of this speech, New Nationalism, called on the national government to be an agency of reform. This is a key step in the national government regulating the economy and caring about what is happening to people and how to deal with those issues. Here's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt from this New Nationalism tour. He said, "I stand for the square deal, but when I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for more substantial equality of opportunity and of reward for equally good service." One word of warning, which I think is hardly necessary. When I say I want a square deal for the poor man, I do not mean that I want a square deal for the man who remains poor because he has not got the energy to work for himself. If a man who has had a chance will not make good, then he has to go to quit. And if you men of the Grand Army, you want justice for the brave men who fought and punishment for the coward who shirked his work, is that not so? Anyway, that's a speech there in 1910. And I'll link you up something online for the entire speech that Teddy gives in 1910. But if you read his speech, you can easily understand how Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism can be viewed as a total rejection of laissez-faire in the Republican Party. The U.S. government was now going to become the agency of change if Teddy got his way. So for TR, there was not enough government to provide essential reforms. In regards to the national economy, he wanted agencies to regulate all interstate business. He also wanted social justice legislation, such as regulation over child labor or regulation protecting women in industry. This is unheard of in this time period. I told you he's different. He wanted national regulation of the economy in general, and he wanted social justice legislation brought to you by the national government. He wanted this because he thought the system had become so abusive, revolution was going to occur. So once again, Teddy Roosevelt is not calling for reform because he's some radical like Debs. No, he's only a different kind of conservative. Now Taft, of course, saw this as an attack. And he was appalled at Teddy Roosevelt, thinking he was trying to take over again. And he was. So at the beginning of 1912, Teddy Roosevelt announced he was running for the presidency again. And he said that under Taft there had been not enough appreciation of what the country needed. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was running the risk of dividing the Republican Party and handing the election to the Democrats. And there was a lot of Republicans who told Teddy to wait until the next election. And, of course, there were a lot of progressives who said, no, we can't wait. The country needs you now. He was pressured to run. And, I think he was maybe a bit irritated at what Taft had done, so he does run for the Republican nomination. So this was a nasty fight for the Republican nomination. Sometimes I think there's nothing worse than when friends fall out. And if there had been a primary system in all states where Republican voters could have voted for who they wanted, I think Teddy Roosevelt would have won hands down looking at some of the numbers. But only 13 states had a primary system. The others used state conventions. And in those 13 states where the voters voted, Teddy Roosevelt won solidly, 238 delegates to Taft's 78. But in those states with the state conventions, due to President Taft being the president and being the head of the Republican machinery and running those state officers, Taft was able to win. So by the time of the Republican convention, the decision all came down to 252 disputed votes. This occurred due to two sets of delegates showing up and saying they were the official delegates. I mean, this is great politics, right? So per election rules, the convention itself gets to decide which votes are chosen, specifically the convention chairman, who, as you can guess, was controlled by the Taft machinery. So Taft won the nomination. Look, it may not be fair, but that's exactly what happened. So Taft used the fact that his group of people controlled the convention machinery to ensure his election. You know, I'm sure TR probably would have done the same thing if he was in Taft's position, but he wasn't. He was on the outside. Roosevelt felt that he was robbed in this election. So TR said he was robbed. He walked out of the convention. He took his supporters and they held their own convention and started their own party. Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressive Party. This is a really important third party. They nominated Teddy for the presidency. This was a one-shot third party, but with Teddy Roosevelt, they were definitely going to be heard. And they had many social workers and professors and the like working for them, so it's a very intellectual movement. They had just about everything except for professional politicians and people with money. So TR accepted his nomination, and his speech was called a confession of faith. He also said he felt like a bull moose, so he became this bull moose became the symbol of this progressive party. So as far as the Progressive Party platform, what did they call for? Well, the Progressive Party called for the federal regulation for all interstate business, big business. It also called for a nationwide primary for choosing presidential candidates. I mean, we don't even have this today. We still use conventions. In the area of social justice legislation, the Progressive Platform called for prohibiting child labor, minimum wages for women. How about that? Social insurance, a forerunner of Social Security. They were calling for this in 1912. I mean, Social Security reform doesn't pass till 1935. So these progressives are way ahead of the times on this one. And they also were the first party to call for women's suffrage, the ability for women to vote. Well, in this election, the Democrats found themselves the new leader in 1912 in the form of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, was a former history professor, look out, and president of Princeton University. And he was a Southerner as well. His only experience in political office was 2 years as governor of New Jersey. He was also a very high-minded individual. He was very idealistic. More importantly, he was a progressive Democrat. So Wilson got the Democratic nomination and came up with his own catchphrase, New Freedom. And there were 3 parts to his New Freedom. Number 1, he said he's going to lower the protective tariff. 2, he's going to create a better banking system. And 3, strengthen the antitrust laws. So that is the platform for the Democrats, the New Freedom platform, those 3 points. Wilson said if he did these 3 things, you would break up the control of the economy by big business and you would restore freedom in America, freedom in the American economy. Now, did you see any social justice mentioned? No, you didn't. You keep that in mind. So in the end, this campaign found 4 parties. Number 1, you had Taft representing the Republican mainstream candidate, the most conservative party available. You also had Eugene Debs as the socialist candidate pushing for very radical change, government ownership. You had Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressive Party. And of course, there was Wilson and the Democrats. Now, this may look like it's going to be a tight race, but the real race was truly simply between Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives, progressive Republicans, and Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats. And remember, they're both progressives, right? They're very progressive-minded individuals for both parties taking a different path here in a sense. Now, you may ask yourself why 3 of the 4 candidates were essentially reform-minded candidates. So they're simply responding to the fact that the country was getting so big and complex, and there simply was no consensus as to how we were going to go about fixing the myriad of problems you've seen in previous podcasts, as well as this one. You also had the assumption that there were many who couldn't protect themselves in the country and needed the government to protect them, such as issues with child labor laws. So there were calls to enact social justice legislation that would regulate the powerful and protect the weak. The difference was how to accomplish this. Well, Wilson's going to win this election. The Democrats will win. But it's interesting to note something here when you look at this map. When you add the votes up, more than 75% of Americans voted for some type of reform candidate, Wilson and Teddy. And if Teddy had been on a unified Republican ticket, he would easily have won this election. So it's a good example of having split parties and third parties and what it does. Well, guys, Wilson would go on to begin work immediately in his first administration in 1913, attacking the three provisions found within New Freedom. He called Congress into session immediately to work on the tariff issue. He broke tradition since Jefferson and talked directly to Congress to tell them what he wanted. It's pretty cool. Now, we've seen previous attempts at tariff reform, right? We saw it with we saw it with Cleveland, we saw it with Taft, didn't work. And you know where the tariff was introduced in the House and then loaded with special interest amendments, resulting in usually a higher tariff, right? Well, a congressman named Underwood introduced a lower tariff into the House. It went to the Senate, and that same process began that we're familiar with. But this time, Woodrow Wilson went to the American people. He appealed to the American people, put pressure on politicians, and it helped that tariff get through and get it through lower in 1913, and it passed. It was the first lowering of protective tariff duties since the Civil War. So Wilson's first attempt had been delivered in a major reform. So part one of New Freedom had been accomplished. Then Wilson turned to the banking system. Wilson led and Congress passed a Reform Act called the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. This created the Federal Reserve System, the same as we have today. It created the outline for what we have today. This maintained private enterprise banking. The government did not own the banking system, but at the top of the reserve system there was established the Federal Reserve Board. It's a regulatory agency. It also created a new currency system, and the board could regulate the interest rates, therefore increasing or decreasing the amount of money in the economy depending upon what was going on in that economy. Wilson had now delivered on his next big topic in New Freedom in the same year, so he's 2 for 2. Wilson had said he was going to strengthen antitrust laws with the intention of being able to bust up more monopolies. Well, Wilson went to work on this, and Congress passed the Clayton Antitrust Act. Yet in the process of passing this act, I think Wilson decided that this was never going to be a real answer to the problem of big business in the United States. I mean, he'd have to be doing antitrust measures 24/7 to get it accomplished. I mean, think about what's the problem here. How could you possibly list everything that a business could do that would be considered an illegal restraint of trade? I mean, how many things would that build up to be, maybe? So this act passed, Wilson signed it, and, he's delivered on his 3 promises of New Freedom, but he's realized that it's not the answer, these antitrust measures. So right in the middle of passing this act, that Clayton Antitrust Act, Wilson helped support and get passed something known as the Federal Trade Commission Act. This commission was established to regulate, it's a regulation of all interstate businesses. And this is one of Teddy Roosevelt's old idea. What's going on here is with Wilson is that he got into power, he looked around, he saw the importance of big business, and he said to himself that breaking them up was not the answer because it actually hurt the country. And that regulation was the answer. And of course, this is essentially Teddy Roosevelt's positions. So Wilson had begun with New Freedom, and he accomplished all 3 proposals of New Freedom. But then he's gone on to Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism and enacted one of Teddy's key proposals. And of course, he did not move on social justice legislation. Well, the next election was coming up in 1916, and Wilson saw that the Republicans were not going to be divided this time. And he's going to have a problem if he wasn't careful. And by the way, Teddy Roosevelt did go back to the Republican Party. But I don't think they were ever going to renominate him after the fiasco of the previous election. But if Wilson and the Democrats wanted to win, they needed to get those old progressive Republican votes, which meant he needed to go ahead and endorse the rest of Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism proposals. And that's exactly what he's going to do. So in 1916, Wilson began moving on the social justice aspects of New Nationalism. And I'll give you some concrete examples of what I mean. So for example, Wilson nominated Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. And this is significant in 2 ways. Number 1, Brandeis was a noted progressive who really believed in social justice legislation. He had made his name arguing cases that were calling for minimum wages for women, etc. And secondly, Brandeis was also Jewish. And it was considered widely radical at the time to nominate a Jewish individual to the Supreme Court. Next, Wilson put his support behind, and Congress passed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act of 1916. This act made the stipulation that if you use children under the age of 14 in your businesses, you can't sell what you produce in interstate commerce. This, in effect, would kill your business across state lines if you didn't abide by the law. And Wilson also supported women's suffrage, which he had never done so before, leading up to this election. So again, this is so important to remember. Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats had began with New Freedom and found that it was not nearly enough, and they moved on to continuing the proposals of Teddy Roosevelt's progressive Republicans' new nationalism endeavors. It's going to help him tremendously. Well, Wilson would run again in 1916, and he wanted to run on that progressive record, but World War I was going on by this point, and we'll talk about that in a different podcast. And in the war, of course, the U.S.'s policy is going to be neutrality. And suffice it to say here, Wilson ran as the candidate who kept us out of war, the peace candidate. And he ran on a progressivism campaign and a peace campaign. And he's going to win this election against the Republican Charles Hughes. Again, more on that later. So Wilson's record was just too tremendous at this time to not win. And after promising to keep us out of war in 16, he's actually going to lead us into war in 17. And when we got into war, the progressive era is going to come to an end because war and progressivism really doesn't mix that well together. But we'll talk about that in a different podcast. So let me summarize this progressive movement. And I really need you to pay attention here. This is very important. I think the progressive era proved one thing. When you get right down to it, the national government is stronger than big business. The government proved that they could tell big business what they could or could not do on many occasions. However, it may be superior, but how was it to use its superiority? How was it going to decide what the public good was? Everyone has their own idea as to what that is. Is the public good served by breaking up big business? Probably not. But is the public good served by regulating big business? Well, you might say yes. But if you're that billionaire businessman, you're going to scream, "Leave me alone. You're hurting the bottom line." The more regulation, the more money I've got to spend taking care of my workers and the environment, etc. And that's money I could use to hire other people. You see the argument, right? So you see how they can spin that argument either way. So I guess it depends. So what do we do here? Well, I guess it's going to depend on who's running the country at any given time. And that's been the way we've approached it since this time period in U.S. history. So what we developed in the progressive era was an approach as to how to deal with big business. We had tried laissez-faire. It didn't work out that well, and we couldn't continue on that path. The other extreme was the socialist extreme of government ownership. That's not really an answer either in this country. So you develop an approach where you either use antitrust or regulation. They're both still there, and that's how we've continued since that period, again, depending upon the political power in the political parties that are in power. I mean, think about it. We still have an antitrust division of the Justice Department. We still have a Federal Trade Commission. Yet in all these examples, the depth of regulation, the depth of antitrust is simply determined by those in power because laws do not enforce themselves. So the approach is determined by us on an ongoing basis. It's not an answer, guys. It's just an approach, and I hope you see this. Socialism is an answer. Laissez-faire is an answer. I just don't think either are really that good. But what you got here in the progressive era were approaches, which I think works pretty well to this day. Now, what were those people doing, Teddy and Woodrow Wilson? Were they trying to destroy our country? Were they trying to destroy capitalism in our country? Absolutely not. They were progressive reformers with conservative purposes. They were trying to prevent this country from becoming so abusive, so ugly towards some people that those same people rose up and revolted.